listen to anybody who tells you not to wear a mask. It matters. It matters, it matters, it matters. We're going to overcome this. But listen to what the scientists say, not the politicians. And I'm a politician, I know, but I'm listening to the scientists.
Seems like what's happened here is quite a few of these government agencies have taken up a new tactic, and that is to try to sway private companies to do their dirty work for them.
Philip Magnus is the Director of Research and Education at AIER. He was actually the person who had done the FOIA request on the Fauci emails, the same emails that Fauci is now being questioned about in court.
God help us.
On November 23, 2022, Fauci sat for a sworn deposition about his own actions in directing the United States pandemic response and his role in suppressing so-called misinformation. In the FOIA request emails, Phil Magnus and his colleagues discovered something wholly unexpected. In early October of 2020, Dr. Francis Collins, then director of the NIH, ordered Fauci and his trusted Lieutenant Clifford Lane to wage a quick and devastating published takedown of a declaration written by eminent epidemiologists from Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford. The GBD was based on long withstanding, evidence-based pandemic policies, but the problem was, it directly competed with the interests of the top-down, unprecedented response to a respiratory virus.
Some will look and say, well, maybe we've gone a little bit too far.
What would the last 3 years have looked like if we hadn't had lockdowns, masks, and mandates? If we hadn't have had the Hunter Biden story and the GBD censored and suppressed through big tech, with the involvement of the highest levels of governmental institutions? The Twitter files and the Fauci deposition are exposing the collusion between big tech and big government, and how that symbiotic relationship made it possible to craft narratives that changed the course of history. What I really wanted to ask Phil first was, what do you see as the thread that ties this together?
Well, I think the thread that we're seeing is common on both of these stories is the role of government, the role of politicians in trying to put their thumb on the scale, trying to sway social media companies to do their dirty work for them. Congress is forbidden from banning speech outright by the First Amendment. Government agencies cannot engage in speech suppression through their own actions. So it seems like what's happened here is quite a few of these government agencies have taken up a new tactic, and that is to try to sway private companies to do their dirty work for them. And you see that both in the Twitter case with figures from the political class, figures from the White House. Some cases it's agency representatives like Anthony Fauci at the NIH that are in direct communication with these private companies, telling them the recurring message is you need to police against quote unquote misinformation. And if you don't engage in policing misinformation, then we'll call you before Congress and subject you to a regulatory hearing. So there are all these kind of subversive tactics that they're using to induce the private companies into engaging in behavior that politicians themselves are forbidden from doing by the First Amendment.
Yeah, so one interesting thing that echoes what you're saying here that came up in the Twitter files was that there was this, if you follow Matt Taibbi, he's done a wonderful thread on this where he goes through basically everything that they've uncovered there. And he shows in this one tweet how they said, we've gotten the tweets from the Biden administration that we need to take care of, and now they've been taken care of. I'm paraphrasing that. What do you see there as, like, what's your take on that whole story?
Yeah, well, there was a clear case where the executives of Twitter as a corporation, the pre-Elon Musk version of it, the one that existed in 2020, had a very clear political preference among them. They something like in excess of 95% of Twitter's political campaign donations went to the Democratic Party, which is fine, whatever. There are different skews in different industries and different firms. But you started to see that manifest itself in the way that they were responding to requests from the respective campaigns in the 2020 election. I'll disclose fully in my own stake. I was not satisfied with either candidate in the 2020 election. Did not support either Trump or Joe Biden. But the fact remains that a company such as Twitter was certainly much more on the Joe Biden side than they were on the Trump side, to put it mildly. And what you have there is a case where Twitter executives are essentially kind of putting their thumb on the scale of the way that media coverage unfolds. And the clear evidence that's coming out of these files from the emails that Elon Musk has permitted to be disclosed is that a couple of executives at the top of the organization at Twitter, I think Vijaya Gadde was the main person. She was the legal compliance officer for the corporation. Basically made this call that they were going to block the New York Post from publishing on Twitter a very negative and damaging story, the story about the Hunter Biden laptop that came out just over 2 weeks before the 2020 election. So this was seen as a damaging story for the Biden campaign. Of course, it's being promoted by the Trump campaign for reasons that aren't hard to discern. But they said basically they were going to weigh in and use Twitter's policies against hacked information to censor the story from appearing on the platform. And this sent off ripples throughout the company. And this is what's come out of some of the documentation that's been provided. There were internal voices in the company, even those on the left, that said, I think we're going too far here. I think this is a bad decision. There's some evidence that they may have even obscured it from the CEO of the company at the time, Jack Dorsey, with this other group of executives. But they made a very clear decision that had strong political implications. And the other thing that we saw after that, when Twitter was the first actor that moved to censor the New York Post on running the Biden laptop story,
Yes.
all of these other social media companies followed suit. They took that as a cue. So, well, we should engage in censorship too. And then the next day, the media trots out these supposed national security experts that claimed with no evidence whatsoever that this was Russian disinformation. A Russian hacker must have gotten into the Biden laptop and provided this to the Trump campaign, which actually turns out years later we know was a complete falsehood. They were just making it up as they go, but they were doing it in a fashion that realized the political implications of this story, and they decided very quickly they were going to put their thumb on the scale and make sure that this story that was potentially damaging in a very closely contested election, one that could have gone almost either way, didn't see the light of day 2 weeks out from the election. So just from an ethical perspective, standing back from like a journalism ethics and a corporate ethics perspective, this is clear interference in political operations of the United States, political election of the United States, for reasons that were not fully disclosed to the public at the time.
It's completely wild. And I'm just going to zoom in on this tweet thread here. In the Twitter files, number 36 of Matt Taibbi's thread, somebody called Sasbo wrote a letter containing chilling passages relaying Democratic lawmakers' attitudes. They want more moderation, and as for the Bill of Rights, it's not absolute. So they said the First Amendment is not absolute.
And there's the interesting thing. It's not just Twitter doing this on their own. There are open channels of communication between Twitter executives and Democratic politicians. And, this would be wrong if it was on the other side, if it was open communication between Republican politicians and corporate officers. But what it shows is it's not strictly a private actor through Twitter as the corporation. This is a private actor that is colluding with political figures that have vested interests in the outcomes of decisions that are made by the corporation itself. And I think there was one of the other tweets he showed there was only one single member of the Democratic Party. It was a representative who spoke out and said, wait a minute, I think this is kind of wrong what they're doing on First Amendment grounds. So Matt Taibbi's whole point here is that the majority of the Democratic Party looked at this act of private censorship and basically gave them the thumbs up and said, yes, we need corporations to do more of that. And you see the same pattern playing out. You move over into COVID misinformation or some of these other areas, climate change misinformation. It's the same argument that's deployed over and over again, mostly coming from the left right now, where they're saying we need these companies to step in and regulate speech on their platform, control misinformation. And if they don't, there's always like this subtle threat behind it. We're going to make their lives miserable in the political scene. We'll call them before hearings and put pressure on them to regulate regulate. So it's kind of like a wink nod, do this on your own or else there will be consequences.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting too because in the world that we live in now, right, these corporations have grown to be so large that some of them maybe are even bigger than governments. And so the amount of power that they possess is quite enormous. Do they have some kind of responsibility to not be colluding with government? Like, do you think that this is a possible violation of the First Amendment?
I mean, it's a tricky legal area because it gets down to where do you draw that line. Now, there are some Supreme Court precedents going back decades upon decades that basically say the government itself cannot overtly recruit another private sector actor to do its dirty work, to do its bidding in suppressing speech. So the legal theory here is that Twitter had crossed that line, and some other politicians and administrative officials that were putting pressure on these companies had crossed that line. If you remember back over the summer, there was this whole controversy about the Department of Homeland Security had basically appointed this misinformation czar.
Mongering is really quite ferocious. It's when a huckster takes some lies and makes them sound precocious by saying them in Congress or a mainstream outlet. So disinformation's origins are slightly less atrocious.
Yes.
Who was a bit of a zealot Twitter warrior, and they were claiming that this is a national security threat that people post quote unquote misinformation on social media. Well, that's setting up an entire agency whose whole function is to induce and provide this type of a pressure on private companies to do its bidding. That does get into some constitutional territory of where it's a line needs to be drawn. It's like a wall of separation between corporation and state would be a good standard here. Otherwise, you don't get a purely private actor in the corporation side, and you don't get a purely public actor in the politician side that are meddling in private corporate affairs. Rather, it's like this collusive arrangement that gets to the worst of political cronyism.
Well, what's interesting there as well is that the political left, and the more extreme you go on that spectrum of the political left, the more you see people like Antifa, or those who proclaim that their enemies are fascists, right? But what you're describing sounds to me like fascism.
Right. Well, there's all these language games that are played in the political spectrum. It's become a tactic on the left to label everything they dislike. It's like everything to the right of Stalin is fascist. And of course, there are people on the right that do the same thing. They'll look at left of center Democratic policies and they'll say, well, that's socialist or that's communist. So it's a name calling tactic. But now it's been embraced by, in like this Orwellian way, by parts of our political spectrum, where the very same people that are basically embracing and cheering on private corporations for colluding with the government to regulate speech are the ones that are calling the speech that they want regulated fascist or totalitarian. And yet they have no retrospection on the fact that their own actions are very similar to what we see in authoritarian regimes of the state and the private sector actually colluding together to exercise control that would go against the basic norms and basic rights of a society.
It's really something to behold, and it's amazing to me that people don't see it. But I suppose if you don't want to see that, then you're not going to see it. You're going to see what you want to see. I want to actually kind of tie together the Twitter files as well as the Fauci deposition. There's a common actor actually there, and that's the deputy attorney from Missouri, right, who is dealing with both of those files. So what he had found, his name is Eric Schmidt, and what he had found here was that the FBI was actually also involved in suppressing the Hunter Biden story and in directing Twitter. I guess then